Should I hold this same pace when I'm running and I hit a hill? So I'm going uphill or downhill. Should I try and keep to the same target pace that I have for my race or for my workout, or should I slow down a bit? So obviously, if you're coming across a hill during a run and you're wanting to hold a certain pace, in order to hold that same pace as you go up the hill, your effort is going to increase. So the question is, what should you do? And that's what we're going to talk about today, because I was asked this question again this week. I get a lot from it was one of my coaches this time that works with our athletes, because they'd been asked by the athlete and they were like, where do we stand on this? So I'm going to talk through what you should do and how it differs between races and training sessions, and also how the advice differs depending on what type of training session you're doing. So we'll talk about the training first, and then at the end we'll touch on the racing. Now, when it comes to the training, you want to take a step back and think, what are we trying to do here? When we do our runs, what are we actually trying to do? And what we are actually trying to do is expose our body to a certain stimulus of intensity of exercise, such that the body adapts to that stimulus and becomes more able to do that. So the way I word that is, we want to expose our body to an intensity stimulus for a given duration of time. Now, the intensity of that experience would be different if you were walking versus if you were sprinting. So if you imagine an intensity spectrum for running, with all the way on the very easiest side we had walking, and all the way on the very hardest side we had sprinting as fast as you could, and then everything in between is on a spectrum. And we could, loosely speaking, we could divide that into three parts. We could have light intensity, which would be like walking. We could have like medium intensity, which would be running, and then we'd have high intensity, which will be sprinting. Now, when you're planning workouts for athletes, or if you're using a training plan that you found online or whatever, usually they'll divide it up a bit more than these three broad zones, because that becomes a little bit blunt as a training tool. So we use a 5-zone system. So we just take that same spectrum and divide it into 5 sections, but there's other ways you can divide it up into 7 or 9 or 11 or whatever you want to do. We use 5. It seems to be the best not bang for buck. Like, it's the best balance between being useful and being precise, but also being like practical and easy to understand. So the way we do it is, we have all the way over at the easy end of the spectrum, where you're sort of walking or running, as jogging, as slowly as you can. We call that your recovery zone, and that's zone 1. Okay, so we have 5. So that's zone 1. Zone 2 is your endurance. This is where you do your endurance runs, your long runs, your easy runs, that kind of, it's where the majority of your training runs will be done if you're an endurance runner, which everybody listening to this podcast is. So that's your zone 2 stuff. Zone 3 is tempo, which is also usually roundabout kind of like your 10K or half marathon pace, depending on your fitness level. And then you have zone 4, which is just above thresholds. So we call it threshold. And then we have the top zone, you can call it anaerobic, VO2 max, sprint. There's different names for it. Yeah, we tend to call it sprint. So then, now that we have these different intensity zones, right, we can prescribe a workout, like go for a half-hour run in tempo pace, or go for a 1-hour run at zone 2 heart rate. So that intensity spectrum, like each of those zones, we can have a heart rate range and a pace range, right? So you'll have 2 types of target that you could have. You could have the target be by heart rate, or you could have it by pace, because obviously when you're running slowly, your heart rate's going to be lower, but also your pace is going to be lower. When you're running fast, your heart rate's going to be fast, but so is your pace. So you can decide which metric you're going to use as your target metric for the workout, depending on a few factors that we're going to talk about in a sec. So when it comes to training, and the question is, should I hold my target pace when I'm running uphill? The answer is no. Right? Because what we're trying to do is hit a certain intensity stimulus for a duration of time. So if we say, okay, you're going to run for 10 minutes in zone 2, and during that 10 minutes, you come across a very steep hill and you try and hold the same pace, your intensity will go up, because you are working harder to sustain the same pace, which will mean that you're no longer experiencing a zone 2 intensity within your body. You're actually going to be in zone 3. So instead of having 10 minutes in zone 2, you might have like 6 minutes in zone 2 with 4 minutes in zone 3. So we don't want to hit the target pace when we're going uphill. Similarly, when we're going downhill, if you just hold the target pace, the effort might become too easy. And the intensity experience, again, instead of being the prescribed, for example, 20 minutes in zone 2, it's, 18 minutes in zone 2, because 2 of those minutes as you were running down the hill, the difficulty of the run became so easy that your body physiologically slipped into zone 1. So that's why for your training, because we're trying to have your body experience a given intensity for a given duration of time, we don't want to use pace as our guiding metric. We don't want to hold pace during that time if it means that we end up working harder or working too easy, because then we're not going to get the stimulus that we're after. We're going to get a slightly different stimulus. So in training, what should we do? Well, it depends on the workout. So we'll go through them one at a time. Now, for steady state runs, runs where you're going at pretty much the same state the whole time. So think endurance runs, recovery runs, long runs, where it's just like run for this distance, like 10K, or this duration of time, like 60 minutes, and stay in the same zone, right? There's no intervals, there's no mucking around, going up and down. It's just like a steady state. For those runs, you'll usually be working in the lower heart rate zones, so 1, 2, and 3, and use heart rate, like if possible. Like the heart rate's not always practical, if you don't have the right equipment, or if you don't have your zones properly calibrated for you. We have lots of episodes on that if you want to check that out. If you live in a very cold place, that can cause issues. Similarly, if you live in a very hot place, like it's not perfect. But when you're dealing with undulating terrain, so where you're getting like lots of uphill and downhill, and you've got like a run which is supposed to be all at the same intensity, then heart rate should better target. Because what'll happen if you're saying, okay, stay in zone 2 for half an hour, for me, that's going to be about, 140 beats per minute. So I'm running along and my heart rate's at 140 beats per minute, and I hit a fairly steep hill. As my heart rate starts to go up, I'll have to slow down to keep within my target heart rate zone of zone 2. If I go over, I think it's 155 is the top of mind one, I've forgotten. Then I'd have to slow down to keep my heart rate in the right zone. So that's going to make sure that I get that zone 2 intensity for the full duration of the prescribed workout. I'm not going to be in zone 3 sometimes and in zone 2 at other times. Similarly, when I run downhill, because it's going to be easier, I might be chugging along at 140 beats per minute heart rate, but then I start going downhill and then my heart rate drops to like 118 because it's easy. I can speed up. I can speed up to get my heart rate higher so I stay in zone 2 for the intensity stimulus. So it's the right intensity stimulus for the right duration of time. Now, the trouble is for interval workouts, like, where you're doing, say, 12-minute intervals in zone 3, or you're doing 4-minute intervals in zone 4, or you're doing 1-minute intervals in zone 5. Like, obviously, there's millions of different ways you could do it. Or you're doing like by distance. So you might be doing like a track session where you're doing 200 meters times 8 and then rest for a few laps and then another 200 meters times 8. Whichever it is, when you're having these workouts that are higher intensity and it's on off, you're pushing into higher zones of intensity and then resting, and then higher zones of intensity, then resting. Heart rate isn't a very good metric as your target because it takes like 30 to 60 seconds to change. So if my heart rate as I sit here right now is like, I don't know, not 100, maybe 60 or something, because I'm kind of amped up for the podcast. And I just got up and start sprinting as fast as I can for a minute. For the first 30 seconds, my heart rate will stay down around 70, 80 beats per minute. It'll take ages to actually come up to like, 160, 170 where it should be, just because that's the way heart rate works. But the difficulty of what I'm doing will be immediately, as soon as I start sprinting, I'm experiencing that intensity. Just because my heart rate hasn't caught up to measure it doesn't mean that that's not the intensity that my body is experiencing. So heart rate's not a very good metric when we are talking about intervals, especially in intervals in zone 4 and 5. Zone 3 is we'll come back to that. So when you're talking about sprint intervals, track workouts, fartleks, tempo intervals, threshold intervals, like these kind of interval sessions, use pace as your target metric and choose somewhere flat. Don't find a hilly area. Do your best, right? Depends where you live. Do your best to make it flat if you can, or as flat as it can be, right? Like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if you do that, then stick to your target pace. So choose the flattest location you can and then stick to your target pace, because heart rate's useless for these kind of workouts. but you are going to be working a bit harder when you're going uphill. So you just want to make sure that those hills aren't too steep, because then you're going to be working a lot harder and you might not even be able to hold the right pace. And then finally, like, what about hill workouts, right? So what do we do for those? So you've got a hill sprints, you've got hill repeats, you've got stairs sessions, where you're climbing up lots of stairs for your workout. For those, heart rate's not usually very good for the reasons that we just spoke about. The intervals are usually too short to make heart rate a useful target. Pace is useless because it depends how steep the hill is, and you'll often use different hills. Obviously, if you're going back to the exact same hill every week for months or years on end, you could probably work out like what your target pace should be. But that sounds a bit boring. So if you're using different hills or in different locations, obviously the steepness of the hill and the length of the hill is going to matter quite a lot to the intensity experience that you have. So heart rate's not very useful because the interval's too short. Pace is not very useful because we don't know what the incline is going to look like. So then we have to default to effort. So you take your effort on a scale of 1 to 10. It goes along the same intensity spectrum, where a 1 out of 10 will be like walking, and a 10 out of 10 is sprinting as fast as you can, and it's a spectrum in between for the other numbers. And then you use effort as your target, and then your interval, you prescribe it by duration. So you might do like 1 minute running uphill at an 8 out of 10 effort times 6. So you find a hill where you can run for a minute without running out of hill, right? And then as soon as you hit a minute, you stop. Even if you're like halfway up the hill, you turn around and go back, so that every time your body gets the same experience, which is 1 minute or 60 seconds at 8 out of 10 effort. It's not getting a different experience each time because you're doing like a hill of a given length. Say it's half a kilometer, and the first time you run up it, you're much faster than the 10th time you run up it. So the 10th time you run up it, you're in zone 4 for a long time. And the first time you run up it, you're in zone 5 for a short time, right? So that you're getting different experiences every interval. Whereas if you prescribe by duration, so it's 60 seconds up the hill and then 8 out of 10 effort, it doesn't matter if the hill's really long, because as soon as you hit a minute, you're going to stop and turn around and go back to the bottom. And it doesn't matter if the hill is really steep or, I don't know, what is the opposite? Not steep? Mild. If the gradient is mild or severe, right? Because if the gradient is mild and you still run out at 8 out of 10 effort, you'll go really far. If the gradient is steep and you run at an 8 out of 10 effort, you won't go very far. But either way, in each scenario, you'll have 60 seconds at an 8 out of 10 effort, because you're going to run at an 8 out of 10 effort. When it's steeper, you won't go as far. That's all it is, right? So that's the best way to do the hill workouts in training, in my opinion. That's the way we do them, is prescribed by effort and give a duration of time to hold that effort, and then use whatever hill you want. So to sum up, because I know that was quite a lot all at once, when you're training, don't hold your target pace when you're going up and downhill. Instead, use heart rate as your target for endurance, long runs, recovery runs, anything in zones 1 or 2. For faster interval sessions, especially in zones 4 and 5, so think threshold, VO2 max, sprint intervals, use pace as your target metric and hold the given pace, but choose the flattest location that you can find to do that workout. And then for hill sessions, use effort as your prescribed metric for target, and use a duration of time rather than a distance for how long the interval will last. Now, when it comes to races, it's a little bit different, because obviously there is going to be some races that are very hilly and some that are, more flat. Some are perfectly flat. Some are constantly downhill. Some are on mountains, right? Like, there's all sorts of different races. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But we also know that if you go by heart rate, you don't really know what time you're going to finish in. We don't really like doing that as runners. Like, I'll just stay in zone 3 and see what time I get. It's like, no, I want to know what my time is for targeting, and I want to know if I beat it, and I want to know how to beat it. I want to know what my splits are if I'm going to be able to beat it, right? So realistically, we have to have a target pace for race day. But then the question is, when you get to the hills, what do you do? Should you try and hold that pace? And then in that scenario, they say you're burning matches, right? Because you're going into zone 3 or 4, maybe even 5, and you're burning off loads of glycogen and phosphagen and all this stuff that you need. It's going to kind of bite you in the ass later. So that's one problem. The other way of approaching it is you slow down, but then you're not on target pace anymore. So what do you do? I mean, I'm sure people have written books about what you should do, right? For you, it depends on your approach, depends on the race, depends on how you've discussed it with your coach, if you have one. And for me, the way I approach it and generally recommend it, if we're talking about a race that does not have a lot of elevation change, so one that's more undulating, think typical races, right? The races in big cities, the vast majority of the races that we do think that kind of terrain. If it's a fairly quote unquote normal race in terms of uphill and downhill, all I would do is when you come across hills, hold the target pace. If it starts to feel really hard, pull back a bit so your effort stays about the same as it has been for the rest of the race. But then when you go down that hill, increase your pace so your effort comes into the same range that it's been through the whole race. So essentially what you're doing is trying to hold your target pace until it feels like you're going quite far away from the effort that you've been experiencing from the whole race. Then you're going to reduce your pace if you're going uphill or increase your pace if you're going downhill to keep your effort about the same. It's not a precise way of doing things, but I find the way when I race and when I give this advice to runners, it's relatively practical. It's easy to remember. You just kind of take the foot off the gas a little bit as you go uphill and then speed up a little bit as you go downhill, and then keep an eye on your splits, right? Keep an eye on the markers when you get to the right places, how you're doing. Do you need to inch up a little bit? Do you need to slow down just a little bit? Normal race stuff. But the other way to do it is just try and hold your pace at all costs. But especially if you've got hills that, are quite severe, what's going to happen is you're going to burn a lot of matches on the way up. And on the way down, you could be running faster and you're going to be running, your body's going to be taking it too easy. And you could say that'll even out, right? And some people do that, right? And that's fine. But the more severe the hills get, obviously, the more tricky that gets. So that's the answers to those questions. What to do about holding pace during training and on race day. If you want any help with this, as usual, we'll leave a link in the description. Just click and book in and we'll have a chat about your running and your goals and see where you might be going wrong and where we can optimize and improve things and help you get to your next race faster. But yeah, cool.